Welcome to our Bible study at Epiphany of Christ Lutheran Church in Apache Junction, Arizona. I'm Pastor Steve Crittenden, and I'm so glad that you've joined us today. This is session 2 of our conversation about heaven. And just to do a little bit of review of what we talked about last time, heaven is an English word. And so since it's an English word, the word itself never shows up anywhere in scriptures, in the Greek of the New Testament or Hebrew of the Old Testament. And we talked last time about a Hebrew word, shamayim, and that when a Hebrew word ends, the I am at the end of that word indicates that this is a plural word. And so whereas the English word heaven is a singular word, the word that it translates in Hebrew is plural. And we talked about, from the creation story, the various heavens or skies that are talked about. And primarily it is the heavens where the birds fly and the rain falls and the sun and the moon and the stars are. And then there is the highest heaven, the heaven of heavens. And we talked about that being the dwelling place of God. And we're going to talk about that aspect of this highest heaven, this heaven of heavens, which I think it's fair to say, I think Jesus teaches us that the word that comes to mind when we in English use the word heaven is talking about this heaven of heavens, which is the dwelling place of God. And we see the dwelling place of God show up in Scripture in a number of places. And I'm going to start with a book that you probably don't have a lot of familiarity with. I don't think it shows up maybe in our Revised Common Lectionary. I'm talking about the book of Nehemiah. And we hear this in the 9th chapter. This is at verse 27. It says, "Therefore you gave them into the hands of their enemies, who made them suffer. Then in the time of their suffering they cried out to you, and you heard them from heaven. And according to your great mercies you gave them saviors, who saved them from the hands of their enemies." Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah here is talking about the exile of the Jews, and that God heard God's people praying. God in heaven heard God's people praying. We also hear read about God's dwelling place in heaven in the 63rd chapter of Isaiah. And this is at verse 15. "Look down from heaven and see from your holy and glorious habitation." So the prophet Isaiah here is speaking about God living in heaven, God dwelling in heaven. And actually, this is one of these places that you've heard me talk about, and that is that not all of the Psalms are in the book of Psalms. And this actually that we just read from Isaiah is a psalm. This would be a song that was being sung and speaking of God looking down from heaven and see from your holy and glorious habitation. But this does then shift us into where we find the most references to heaven being the dwelling place of God, and that is in the book of Psalms. And it begins right away in the second book. Psalm 1 and 2 are really introductory psalms, introductions to the entire book of Psalms. And we hear this from the second psalm. I'm going to start it at the beginning. "Why do the nations conspire and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed. Now, what's happening here is the psalmist, church tradition, Jewish tradition, saying that this is David speaking. The psalmist is saying that the kings of the world are conspiring against God and the one who God has chosen to lead God's people, his anointed. This is really interesting here, and this is really important because the word in the original Hebrew, here in the second Psalm 2, this is at verse 2, where it says, against the Lord and his anointed, the word that anointed translates in Hebrew is Messiah. And so this is pointing out that David is just one of God's messiahs, just as Jesus is also one of God's messiahs, one of God's anointed. And so the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. Which is to say, let's separate them. Let's get them away from one another. Let's destroy the community that God's people is. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has them in derision. And so right away in the second Psalm, in Psalm 2, we hear about God being in heaven. The one who sits in heaven is laughing at the plans of the enemies of God's people, because of course God is the one who's going to be in charge of the things that happen. We can go on now to the 11th, Psalm 11, and this is at verse 4. The Lord is in his holy temple. Now, the word that's translated as temple here is the same word that gets translated as palace. And were I translating this, I would have said not temple because it's confusing. This is before the temple. But the Lord is in his holy palace. The Lord's throne is in heaven. So we're hearing again that heaven is the dwelling place of God. We hear it again in the 14th Psalm. This is in verse 2. The Lord looks down from heaven on humankind. And so we see this theme, perhaps, that that is coming through the Psalms, through these hymns and these prayers. We can sort of think of the Psalms, the collection of Psalms that we have, as being an ancient Jewish prayer book or hymnal. And we hear the same thing again in the 20th Psalm at verse 6. Now I know that the Lord will help his anointed again, his Messiah, his chosen. I know that the Lord will help his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven. He's answering from heaven because that is where it is that God is dwelling. And there's something, there's an interesting thing that ties all of these references together, all of these writings from Nehemiah and Isaiah and the Psalms. There's one thing that I find really, really interesting about that, and that is they all come from the same period in Jewish history. All of these writings come from what we call the Second Temple period. This is the period from about 515 BC until 70 AD, until after Jesus has died and risen and ascended. About a generation later, in 70 AD, the Roman Empire comes and destroys the temple, the Second Temple, sometimes called Herod's Temple, and it's gone forever, and it's gone to this day. The only thing that's left of it is what we call the Wailing Wall, or part of the Western Wall is still there. But the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and that brought an end to the Second Temple period of Jewish history. But all of these writings come from that time, come from the time after the exile. The first temple period is about 1000 BC to about 586 BC. That was when the Babylonian Empire came in and destroyed the first temple. And so there was that period during the exile when, of course, there's no temple and the people are exiled to various parts of the Babylonian Empire. And they're brought together. They're offered the opportunity after the Persian Empire and the Emperor Cyrus conquers the Babylonian Empire. The Persian emperor allows the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild their temple if they want, under some particular circumstances. But these writings come from that period, that time after the exile is over with. And now, no doubt, some of these were stories that had been told before, but they were compiled during this time of the Second Temple. And that's really, I think, not just interesting, I think it's important because it is this time during and after the exile that we see the Jewish interest in afterlife is growing and growing and growing. When we look at the writings that we know are from before the period of the exile, what we see is that there's not much interest in the afterlife. In fact, when we look at that, remember cosmology, that picture of the earth, and the earth is flat, and what's below the earth is the place of the dead. That's Sheol. That's just where the dead go. It's much later during this exile and post-exile period that we see the development of some theology about what's going on there. But until the time of the exile, there's just very little interest in what happens to God's people after they die. And there's very little written about that. That becomes a much bigger issue during and after the exile. And there's a number of reasons for that, but one of the reasons I want to lift up today has to do with God's rewards, has to do with how God blesses people, how God was understood to be blessing people in their lives. And what we see is that they understood that God was blessing them with life. First of all, God was blessing them with their own lives. God was blessing them with the lives of the community and God's people. But individuals were blessed with life also in this way. We read about people being blessed as being wealthy, and the wealthy people were people who had large flocks and large herds. And they were understood to have been blessed by God with these herds and these flocks and with the number of children that they had. And this is all life. These are all living animals. Forgive me for putting children in there, but that's how it was understood. It was understood that God was blessing somebody, but these blessings that sometimes get talked about as wealth are particularly life. They're living things, herds and flocks, and of course children also. But then something changed. Something changed during the time of the exile, and it's really important that we pay attention to that. About 700 or so BC, what we see is the beginning of the veneration of a Greek goddess Moneta. And with the veneration of Moneta, we see the development of standardizations of currency. And in fact, it is this Greek goddess Moneta is her name is where we get the English word money from. And so now what's happening is that wealth is being viewed not as having herds and flocks, the way God was known to be blessing people, but now wealth was understood to be money. And this concept, this idea of wealth and money become even more and more and more important under the Roman Empire, because under the Roman Empire we see the standardization of money, and of course the Roman Empire is a physically large empire, and so that standard money is being traded throughout that empire. And that allows wealth to grow and grow and grow, and that's wealth that really doesn't involve God. The flocks and the herds were understood to come from God because we have a creation story that tells us that they came from God. We have two creation stories that tell us that, but the money doesn't come from God. And in fact, we see that it is. We hear Jesus speak about this. It is the image of the emperor that's on the coins because the money comes from the emperor. So the wealth that comes with money is not viewed as being blessings from God, because God's gift is life. God's blessings are around things that give life. Now we know in the 21st century that poverty steals life from people. We're going to see this here in the very, very near future. There's a lot of criticism about politicians who want to reopen things too soon with this coronavirus that's going around. And I'm one of those who is critical of moving too quickly. But at the same time, we have to remember that while this COVID-19 is a threat to life, we also know that poverty is a threat to life. And the longer the economy is shut down, that's going to create more and more and more poverty. And that's life-robbing poverty is. But what we're talking about here in the Second Temple period is that it's understood that that this wealth that people can have with the money isn't necessarily meaning that it's a blessing from God. And so now they're looking for ways to find how can God be blessing me now. We also see a change in the economy of urbanization. And when we have urbanization, then we don't have the opportunity to have flocks and to have herds. And then we also have the issue of now a Roman Empire where movement around the empire is relatively easy in the human times of human history. It got to be relatively easy to move about. Well, it's a lot easier to move your wealth when it's money than it is when your wealth is in herds. And so that continues to develop this notion of God blessing in other ways. The other thing that's happening is that during the time of the exile, God's people were being exposed to the writings of the religions, other religions in the world, and they were learning about something that was a focus of other religions that wasn't a focus of Judaism, and that is the afterlife. And so coming back from the exile, God's people were more interested in the afterlife because they hadn't really thought about it too much until they were exposed to all these other writings and teachings about the afterlife. And so that interest in the afterlife then brought the idea of that God's ultimate blessing is to dwell with God in the place where God dwells. Now we have to keep in mind that there are a number of schools of Judaism, It's not monolithic. Just as we have denominations in Christianity, not everybody was in agreement in ancient Judaism, just as everyone isn't in agreement today in Judaism. And there were a couple of major schools of thought. One was a group called the Sadducees, and another, the other one, I'm spacing it right now, the Pharisees. And one of the big differences between these two had to do with the afterlife, and that is that the Sadducees did not understand that God would be able to continue to bless people after they had died. The Sadducees believed that once you died, that was the end of the opportunity for God to bless you. But the Pharisees did not believe that. The Pharisees understood that God could continue to bless after somebody had died. And the way that would happen is that God would bless those people with being in God's presence, which is to say that when they died, they would go and live where God lives. They would dwell with God in God's dwelling place, which is heaven. Now we're going to talk more about this. We're going to talk more about what heaven is like. I want to remind you that unlike hell, the scriptures talk about heaven as being an actual place. Among those is John 14, when Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you. And so I don't want there to be any misunderstanding of my theology or the teaching of our church. Heaven is a real place. It doesn't depend on hell. We don't have to have hell in order to have heaven. Hopefully we have separated those two things. We're going to take a look in coming sessions about what heaven is like and how heaven functions. And I really am so happy that you joined us here, and I look forward to our next sessions on the subject of heaven. God bless you.